Welcome to Inspired People, Inspired Places. This is number 5 of 10 for our second season. Um, just want to thank you for joining us. This is the Orion Growth Place here in Open Campus on the Verbella platform. And we want to give a big thanks to Sarah Segrist and all of the Verbellians here that are on Open Campus and do such a great job of onboarding everybody and guiding us through and being, a great resource for our team here. Um, Dave Cairns will lead the conversation when we get started, and Chris Moeller is normally standing here giving this spiel, but he is on a plane flight back from Cornet Global in Denver, Colorado, so he's not going to be here. He'll watch the video, which I'm currently recording a video and will post to YouTube hopefully later today or tomorrow. So you can go back and watch this. You're going to see it from my perspective, behind the horns, so to speak. Uh, and normally I'm not dressed like this. Happy Halloween to everybody. Certainly appreciate you being here on this fun day. Couple housekeeping things to mute your mics. It's down there in the bottom left hand corner. Use the chat right next to that for Q&A. I'll try and do my best to keep up with Q&A and lead that today. And then, as always, we will get a group picture at the end of the session. So before you leave, if we're here at the end, all here at the end, if you're able to stay, we'll line up under Brian and Nick's pictures and do a group wave and take a snapshot. All right. So, not sure if Brian's
Here's what I'm thinking, John. Here's what
Yeah.
I'm thinking. Just go ahead, introduce Nick and Brian with our bios. I will get started. We will start with Nick, and let's just move ahead. And I think
Okay.
Brian is finding his way in. I don't know if he's got some sort of technical challenge, but if nothing else, it can be the Nick Bloom hour if we have to.
That works too.
We'll make it work.
I mean, the interesting thing about Brian is this would be his second time here with us at Inspired People, Inspired Places. So if he's not able to get in and join us, you can always go back and watch his episode, which I think was like 8 or 9, if I recall. But Brian Elliot is co-founded Future Forum. He's the best-selling author of How the Future Works, and he wanted us to keep that short and sweet. So hopefully he'll be able to join us. And then Nick Bloom in the room is the William Eberly Professor in the Department of Economics at Stanford University and has been working on the work from home movement for 20 years. So welcome, Nick, and hopefully welcome Brian soon. And yeah, the applause button, we can all give a round of applause. I think it's F4 if you want to give a round of applause. So with that, Dave Cairns, I'll hand it over to you.
That's joyful. Okay, well, I've got everyone here. I got Brian Elliot on the phone for the Rebellions. He's locked out on a 15-minute lockout or something like that. So if anyone could assist with getting him in sooner than that, that would be great. If anyone from Verbella wants to send me a DM privately to sort of try to coordinate that, cool. And I'll just kick off with Nick. Okay, we'll figure it out. Okay, Brian, thanks. Anyone from Verbella have a comment while I just get my introductory notes handy? Sarah, what's the best way to go about this for Brian?
There's a few
He's
comments.
resetting his password. There's a cool off period. We'll work behind the scenes. I don't know if we can override it or not.
Okay. Then just give me 1 second here because I'm dealing with this Huawei device. Okay. Well, thanks for everybody who's here. Really appreciate the new and old faces that are in the room. Nick, thank you so much for your time here as well. I'm going to keep my opening remarks brief. We are here to talk to two of the top experts in digital first workplace transformation and work from home research. Getting these two perspectives, because I know we will get Brian in here at some in one room, is rare, no matter the modality, but to get them in the metaverse, really epic and on brand with the future, to say the least. For Nick, you being here, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And to kick things off, all I really want to do is basically say that I think we're in a bit of a weird and confusing moment right now in 2023 related to the future of work. I'm not the only one who feels this way. I'm talking to a lot of our colleagues and collective peers. I make content every day. And one comment from one of our peers really stuck out to me. I'm not going to name them, but this is what they said. The conversation around new ways of working and the meaning behind it has stalled. It feels like we were building momentum now and direction, and now it feels like we're stuck in the mud. So Nick, for you to kick things off and keeping it really simple to just allow you to creatively express here, do you feel that we are stuck in the mud right now? And in considering your answer, I'd love to know like what you think the key challenges are, not necessarily what the solutions are.
Great. So thanks. Lovely to be here. I'm staring at a witch and some of the cats standing on their head, which is fantastic. So this is a lot of fun. Yeah, I mean, weirdly, this morning I posted on LinkedIn something that I didn't think it was that controversial about how the latest Castle data came out this morning, and it's actually office occupancy is back down. I don't know if anyone else saw it. And our sway and census data, which is one is 10K Americans a month and the census is 40K, are also flat for 2023. So yes, it's stuck. I wouldn't say mud. I mean, I have in mind like a three-part story. It's kind of like an ice hockey game. There are 3/3. The first third is like a Nike swoosh. So the first bit was basically 2020, 21, 22 when work from home levels were dropping. The return to office was, in the ascendancy and people were coming back. 2023, when you look at the data, it is stuck, but I don't think it's mud. I think it's flat. And then my guess is 24, maybe 25 onwards will start picking back up. Because in the long run, I mean, look at what we're on now. Look at this, the Verbella setup. This just didn't exist probably 3-4 years ago. The technology is getting so much better. Laptops, cameras, audio, virtual reality, AR, etc. So longer run, we're going to start heading back up. And in fact, to take a very data perspective, we have data from 65 to 2019 on work from home, and it was before the pandemic, doubling every 15 years. So at some point, normal service will resume. I think right now we're like the tide, it's kind of ebbing and flowing because there's forces in different directions, but 25 onwards, I think we'll start rising again.
Yeah, and so maybe we'll riff on things a little bit differently with this session just while we're waiting with Brian. I will ask you a follow-up and then maybe we can get some audience participation going earlier.
That's great.
So
yeah, let's do that. That would be great.
Yeah, so here's follow-up, Nick. Taking away, the data is the data, you're right. Like we're kind of like we've reached the equilibrium, or as you said this morning, like the return to office is officially dead in the sense that its uptick is not happening any more than now. But like if you were to go beyond the data and more from like the sentiment of employees or from like a stalling out of progress relating to changing the ways that we work, can you think of anything that comes to mind for you, or do you see that directionally we really are making progress still at this moment, not just in what the data says, but how organizations are responding to changing how their employees are working?
Why don't I go through? I can think of like 3 kind of flashpoint themes. So one is CEOs versus the rest. So you've seen in the media, there's a lot of big name CEOs, Jamie Dimon, David Solomon, Elon Musk. I mean, they're the most high profile ones, but there are a bunch of others I've heard directly or indirectly from who are really against work from home. The issue with these folks is they've had super successful careers. They've done incredibly well. They typically own literally tens of millions of dollars in the equity of their firms, and work is pretty much their life. They are focused on being in the office 80 to 100 hours. So those folks, they're in the media and they make a lot of the noise sounding like we're all going back, and they set these mandates. But as soon, I've talked to a large number, dozens, probably at this point, hundreds of people, just one level down. The folks, kind of the rest of us, senior middle management down to employees, don't really want that. They want to be work from home normally, 2 days a week. So that's a big flashpoint. And I think basically the rank the rest is going to win because the CEOs are, there's so few of them. And as you've seen, they're struggling to enforce this. So that's one thing. That's why it sounds like there's a fight. Another big, I think, more real world kind of fight or argument debate is between choice versus flexibility. I changed my mind on this. So in 2020, I was saying you should let people choose the days they come in. From looking at the data and talking to hundreds of people, the thing that pisses people off most is coming into the office to be on a Zoom or to be doing email or stuff. And people say, why did I bother commuting in for that? And so I think we really need to coordinate, even if it's only 1 or 2 days a week. So if you have a team, it's probably best to say, look, each and every employee in this team that works together just should come in on the same days. And I'm aware that restricts choice a bit. It doesn't, team by team or the company can select the days, but that is another flashpoint. And I've heard situations of companies saying like X is introverted. They want to come in for their 2 days a week on Friday and Monday when no one else is around. And that's not really ticking the box in a hybrid system. I'll pause there. Actually. Why don't I stop?
Yeah. Well, I like it. I'll make a note and then turn it over to the floor for any questions or comments that they may have. But I find it funny you bring up Elon Musk and also bring up concept that he talks about, which is called the skip level. Like going to a lower level of management to figure out where a problem may be, and you're doing the same related to the future of remote working, which is kind of funny. Anyway, who has any questions or comments at this point? We'll just do the session a little different than normal. Feel free, anyone, put your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question. This is Carrie. So one of the things that I've heard a lot about from colleagues are folks who were hired to be remote employees during the remote boom, if you will, and now are being subject to return to office initiatives. And there's a lot of concern around whether that's fair, whether there's protections for those people. And I'm just curious to hear what Nick's thoughts are about how organizations are contemplating this when these folks were hired to be remote, and some live really far away from the office where they're supposedly supposed to start going in. That just seems like a really weird backsliding of the home remote work and progress we made.
No, you are totally right. So I'll break it down into kind of the legal and the ethical sides of this. So on the legal side, I think it depends a lot, to be honest, on what their contract said. Contracts often have usual hours and usual place of work, and it may well be their usual place of work isn't stipulated. So potentially they're on the contract, there's nothing they can do to be forced back, and it may almost be worth talking to an employment law. That's not me. My sister-in-law is such an employment law, but I'm not an expert on this, but depends on what they've been signed on. They may not actually have to go back. On the kind of bigger picture, long run fairness, I think it is tricky. This has happened. You're completely correct, and I hear it a lot. There's no perfect answer. So flip it from both sides. From the employee's perspective, you're right. They were hired for a job that basically has changed. So at a minimum, they definitely get some adjustment period. In my mind, I might have said 6 months. In the long run, what one option in the long run is create teams. Like, Stanford, we have about 1,000 remote people, and it may be people that are hard remote can move roles. What you want to avoid for them is being one of 8 people hired into a team, and initially everyone's remote, the other 7 come back in, and you're the only person left remote. That's a kind of pretty soul destroying experience, because basically you're being left out of things. So yes, it's not ideal. And it's really a mistake of the firms, honestly, to have committed to fully remote at a point they didn't know. And it shows kind of desperation. What I hear happens, but I'm not sure this is right. Firms will give employees 6 months notice. And then at that point, offer some plan B. Like if you don't want to come back to hybrid, then move to a remote team, or we'll give you 3 months severance or something like that. But yeah, it isn't great. I mean, I was advising companies not to do that. Right back to 2020, if you're going to hire someone, make sure it's clear that this is, if it's remote, let them know the time scale for what it would be remote and what the long run plans are, including if you're not sure. That's fine. The problem is committing to something that they now break.
Yeah. Nick, so we have Brian in the room. Welcome to Brian. And Brian, why don't you stand right at the front, man? Feel free to just walk up, stand in front of your face.
Yeah, well, the joy of it is I've got to figure out, I remember this from last time, but like how to not stare at the back of the head of my avatar for the next hour.
Oh my
Always
God.
a good time.
Well, you'll figure it out. Well, thanks for making the effort. And for anybody who's got their mic not on mute that isn't speaking, it would be great if you could knock it off. So Brian, just to cue you up, we would love to hear from you as to whether you feel that we're sort of stuck in the mud or not right now in the context of the future of work. I think that there's a lot of fatigue out there that I've heard from colleagues and that I think we see on social media lately, and wondering if you feel anything has stalled out that needs to be, reconsidered or any perspective you may have on that.
Yeah, I think we are kind of in a bit of a rut. To be honest, we're 3 years into debating the same thing over and over and over again, which is, office clear, answers to how to approach this that a lot of firms have taken. Not just Atlassian, it's the Allstates of the world, and it's the is and other people out there. But I think it's because there's still a fair number of more senior executives. I was in a group of folks that were 30-year business school grad, which is kind of days, but I was in a group that had 40 and 50-year business school grads. And the challenge, I think, is the headlines really do get to them. They just read the headlines, right? And they read the headlines about Wall Street's going back to the office. And they also see and hear the sort of TikTok fueled anecdotes about, are people really working at home? And God forbid you get them started on Gen Z, kind of kids these days type of thing. And it creates this sort of fear that unless we get people back in hallways where we can monitor them, that we're somehow, missing out. And so there's that tug of war that's still happening, 3 years on, which is you've got those folks who are, kind of fearful and worried about that and need a sense of control back and are pushing for this. And then you've got other firms that are taking a very different stance and I think going to take advantage of the firms that don't. But, it's the same debate, which is kind of sad in some ways, when it would be really nice to get past, days a week in the office and start talking about how do we use time, how do we build trust, how do we use tools, and not just talk about the where question.
Yeah, I dig it. So let's actually move into the meat of it right now. So it feels like we are moving away a bit from centralized behaviors and workflows, things like commuting to the office at the same time, relying on physical infrastructure to get the job done, synchronous meetings being the default, et cetera, and perhaps moving more to a decentralized version of the same, a future state where days are more nonlinear, the commute becomes a less common activity, and technology is hopefully working for us a little bit more than maybe enslaving us. So it's a bit of a lofty future state that I think we're all grasping at and trying to move towards. I'll start again with Brian. Like right now in 2023, especially with some of the sentiment backlash from CEOs, like how do you feel we take baby steps to get there from a human behavior perspective? And then I'd love to know from Nick how the data might help, massage or make that more palatable to executive leadership.
I think the thing that helps with executives, the thing that I've found helps, is actually give them some concrete examples of other ways of working. I think the challenge is if you've done things one way, the same way, essentially for 30 or 40 years, it's often hard to imagine something different, right? It's the same problem as if you, back in 1990 said, I'm going to give you an iPhone, what would you pay for it? Nobody would have said I would pay $1,000 for this device, right? Because they couldn't imagine all the applications and all the things. So let me give you a concrete example. One of the things that I hear all the time is back to the topic of innovation, right? Which is, well, how can we really innovate if we aren't together in the office? And one of the examples that I like to use is brainwriting. Brainstorming, often the picture that somebody has in their head is, I'm going to get my team in an office with me in front of a whiteboard. And usually the person who's saying that is someone who likes holding on to the pen at the marker at the whiteboard, for dear life. And they're going to kind of conduct, the crowd there. And you may get an idea or two out of that, but you're going to get an idea or two out of the people who are already comfortable with you as a leader, and probably the people who've been there for a while, and maybe the people who look like you. More often than not, those innovation sessions are groupthink, and you can tout research that sort of shows that. But if you say that to an executive, they sort of look at you blankly and go, yeah, but what do I do instead? And so, I picked this up from Adam Grant, I think first, who got it from somebody else, but this concept of brainwriting, which is give your team the prompt, give them the problem you're trying to solve or the, report that you're trying to digest, and say, hey, look, I want you to spend a couple of hours with this over the next week. I want you to come up with your own, 3 to 5 most interesting solutions or observations, keep them to yourself. And then when you bring the group together, have them then share all of their ideas, share it into a common, you can do this in a Google Doc or Microsoft Word doc if you want to. But what you do in doing that is you're going to get more ideas. You're going to get the breadth. You're going to get the ideas from the introverts in the room and the people who need this time to think about it. You're also going to get the ideas from the people who are new to the organization or who are more junior or who are in. And you're going to avoid that kind of groupthink problem. You're going to actually take advantage of the diversity that you're trying to hire. And I know this is a long-winded example, but one of the things that I've found with executives is unless you give them a concrete example of another way of working, it's really hard to imagine something that's different out of whole cloth.
That was good. I appreciate it. Nick, do you have anything that you want to add to that in any way, shape, or form?
It's a great point. There's a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science on what's called bursting. So interesting, is very much connected to what Brian said. So they did a randomized control trial. They solicited like a couple of hundred people to come in, and they broke them up into different setups. So one of them, they forced them into a room for 6 hours together, and they had to come up with new ideas for the products they're randomly given. A second group, they forced them all into individual rooms for 6 hours, and they had to come up with ideas on their own. And the third, they did what's called bursting, where they had to meet for an hour, group, then go off individually for an hour, and then meet for an hour, and then come back. And they found the third group was by far the most innovative. And the idea is we kind of benefit from time together, but you also benefit from quiet time. And this is why hybrid in the research data looks like, if anything, it actually somewhat increases productivity and innovation. So if you think of a classic setup, maybe I come to the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I have time together, we're meeting, or I'm out on the road. Basically, I'm not particularly at home. Monday, Friday is some quiet time. I can think, concentrate, reflect. Both of those are really important. You kind of don't want to overload on one or the other. So my sense is that, I talked to a vast number of execs, managers, slightly less CEOs. Interesting issue is I spoke to a lot of CEOs in 2020, 21. By this point, it's moved up down more to like the CHR or maybe CFO that oversee real estate folks decision. Now there's more fine tuning. I think the media totally overplays a lot of the debate. Most companies I talk to now have accepted hybrid. I'm not sure I've talked to a company that's trying to get people back in 5 days a week. Maybe that's because, the rare exceptions. If you look at the flex data, the number of companies that are trying to get professionals and managers back 5 days a week is very few and far between. I don't know, it's like 5%, 10% of companies. The huge majority are really focused now on like hybrid work. And Brian is totally right. It's kind of like organizing it, structuring it, make sure people are happy with it. They're coming in. I was going to point out, it's not that radical. So if you go back to 2019, no, everyone was doing work in the mornings, sometimes, or maybe after work, or occasionally on the weekends. So, back in 2019, we're probably only in the office 40 hours a week. You're on the road, you're at clients, you're out, you're at conferences. So I don't think hybrid is actually that radical at all. It's just a slightly more home-based version of what we were doing before. I used to work at home sometimes before. I just do more of it now. It's not a 0-1 thing.
Yeah, I do think the media loves playing to this and loves playing it up and loves taking the Steven Schwartzman thing and playing around with it. But Nick, what you reminded me of too is like you can take 2 pieces of research recently. You can take Raj Chowdhury's work from like basically a year ago that said the optimum hybrid setup for most teams was 25 to 40%. And that doesn't mean 2 days a week necessarily. It may mean 1 week a month or even 1 week a quarter. That was one piece that he did. And then there's something that Gallup just put out recently too that was looking at individuals. And what their research said is that 60 to 80% individual heads down time on your own, wherever it works for you, whenever it works for you, is optimum. So they're both basically saying the same thing, which is if somebody made me pull a magic number out of the hat, it wouldn't be bad to say that 20% of the time that you spend is spent together with the team at a minimum as a way of making sure that you're building those bonds and you're doing the kind of collaborative work. You just want to make sure that you understand that, like, when you say that to a team, you got to also support it, because part of what's happened here is back to, I think, when I walked in the room, companies have hired people in more broad geographies. If you say to people, you should be together with your team 20 to 25% of the time, you've also got to figure out how they're going to do that. Maybe that means they actually need to travel to be together. Or maybe that means you need to think about how you recompose your teams.
Yeah, totally. One group, by the way, that's interesting, that's different, is folks in their early 20s. So I see an enormous variation over life cycle. So if you look at, I think of my students at Stanford on the MBAs, in fact, I was talking to my older daughter yesterday on exactly this. These groups tend to want to go in 3-4 days a week because they want to get mentored. As people get into their 30s and 40s, we see people strongly prefer to spend a lot more time at home because they have young kids, families, they have very, stable out of work social setups. And so I also think the tricky thing is you're trying to fit a one size fits all on teams, whereas in fact younger folks may just want more time in the office. They tend, they don't have great living accommodation. There are 4 of them in an apartment in New York, and there's no space for to have all of them at home. Whereas in your 30s and 40s, people tend to live in more like in larger apartments or houses with a home office. That's often the issue. That's partly the issue with the CEO types, so typically in their 60s now. Extrapolating across a whole firm where their own circumstance with no kids and a nice, luxury limo isn't very representative of the rest of their company.
Not to mention the chaos they create when they decide that, you need to move back to your central location.
I mean, that question on the fully is a big issue. I mean, the other issue, by the way, that I think it was, I can't remember who Carrie maybe mentioned it. The other big issue I hear a lot is, I was just looking at data on whether to pay people that are remote, same or location varying salaries. That was another issue that came out of the pandemic, because what happened is a lot of organizations in 2020 sent everyone home to fully remote and said, we'll keep the pay as it is, which makes total sense. You don't want to be messing around with pay at that point. But then people moved. So you have, somebody that came from the, Albuquerque office and someone came from the San Francisco office living next door to each other, but they're paid different amounts for the same job. In the data, it looks like most common thing now is national pay scales. So having pay variation across the US is only there in about 1/3 of people we surveyed. 2/3 say they pay the same, but pay typically varies across country borders. Fully remote workers.
Right. So guys, I'll jump in and interject here. Thank you for all this so far. I want to make sure that we maybe wrap up the meat of this conversation in the next 8 minutes to allow for some healthy Q&A. I think just to close things out, I want to frame something as a thought exercise, and to go to the Flex Index data that you're both very familiar with. One of the key statistics that stands out to me is that 33% of the companies that are surveyed by Scoop in the Flex Index are fully flexible or remote first in their ethos. And I guess when I think of that as a broker myself, someone who actually spent a ton of time working with startup companies, helping them find office space over the years, this feels like a pretty big detour in a different direction than what I was witnessing pre-pandemic, where these were, of course, obviously people are out of the office for meetings, for sick days, for vacation, etc. But the cultural norms were really show up at the office every day, just like all the bigger large institutional companies out there too. So when we see 33% of younger, smaller companies being fully flexible, and then we think of a notion like Chris Hurd is often talking about, which is would offices have existed if we had the internet before they became a thing? And I mean, obviously I want to use that example pretty loosely, but really what I would love to get from both of you to close this formal part of the conversation out is do you have any shower ideas lately that are coming to you, or fever dreams that are keeping you up? Just what are the things that you might not be specifically sharing through your research or your posts or your talks, things that you're really thinking about tangentially about the future when we think of how structurally different some younger companies are thinking about the future? I'll start with Nick. I don't know if anything comes to you.
No, it's funny. I was going to say just anecdote. We see it in the Flex Index, but just anecdotally, I'm advising 6 startups. In fact, many of them overlap with Brahm. And what you see is they're all at least hybrid, and 4 of them are fully remote. I think it makes a lot of sense for startup companies not to take on board office space. Why? Well, if there's 3 or 4 of you, you're typically very engaged. You're often a bit more experienced. You are, as Brian said, meeting up anyway, every month or so. Saves on capital costs. It makes you more flexible. So there seems to be a natural life cycle particularly for, higher tech finance startups, whereby they mostly are founded remote. And at some point when they start growing larger, I mean, I'm thinking like 30, 40, 50 employees, they may be taking some office space more like as a base. Maybe they're in, 1-2 days a week, or use it as a space sometimes to meet up. If you're honestly not using office space more than a couple of days a week, there's no point in having it. So there are companies like Gable that will instead let you hire space day to day, hire meeting events or radius. So if I were starting my company up to 20, 30 people, and, the company's out advising or investing, I'm kind of suggesting don't pay for office space at this point. When you're larger, yeah, it makes sense. If I think of Stanford University, my employer, it clearly needs office space and it needs teaching space, etc. But if we're a small ed tech startup, no reason why we can't work from our homes and meet once a week and, some kind of rented office space for the day. So I think that's the way to go. And in fact, by the way, I just end before I pass to Brian, there's been an explosion in startups in the US. It's really fantastic. For decades, economists have been lamenting declining dynamism. There's less new firms being created. We just count them from the IRS. And suddenly, post-pandemic, that's gone up by about 20%. So we're now in a new era of, startup fervor. And I think a lot of it is that it's just easier to do it if you work from home, particularly if you started up as a side gig. You don't need to pay any capital. You can start your business up selling stuff online, or, a stall on the weekend in a farmer's market or something. Who needs offices for that?
Brian, fever dreams.
Yeah.
What do you got?
Yeah, just to sort of wrap out a next thing. If you look at that fully flexible thing, Dave, one thing to keep in mind though is the employee choice thing includes a bunch of companies that are actually just rethinking how much space they need, right? Because that's got Atlassian in it and HubSpot in it and PagerDuty in it, that are actually still keeping some chunk of, an office building, but they're also starting to think about like, hey, we need regional gatherings. I love PagerDuty's example of like any city in the US where we've got, I think it's like 40 plus employees, at least once every 6 months, we'll host a gathering to get people together. And they may need space for doing that. Maybe it's a hotel, maybe it's a radius space, maybe it's a liquid space thing. But I do think it's going to change radically how that works. I think the bigger thing just is, picking up on the startup side of things, there's a huge innovator's dilemma at work here, which is a lot of bigger, older companies now, benefit from their incumbency, but it's an incumbency that's built on something that they did a decade or more ago, right? We happen to be the oligarchs of a slice of technology. And what you're seeing is newer, nimble companies. They're actually building much faster because they're able to tap talent from all over the place. They're actually building a trust-based environment, and they will eat away at those guys. And they will eat away at them slowly but surely. But the pace of change isn't slowing down. And I think, the fever dream I've got is a lot of small fish become mid-sized fish, and they keep that sort of trust-based way of working and focus a lot more on, the outcomes they're trying to drive than monitoring human beings.
Thank you for that. Okay, well, I think this is a great opportunity to turn things over to a more informal Q&A with audience. There's a great group here today. Thanks for everybody who's come. Stand up so I can maybe see people a little bit better. But for anyone who wants to put their hand up and start off, I will just pass it over.
Hey, Dave, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Go ahead, man.
Yeah, it's Glenn. And this might be a little bit on what Brian was just saying, but does anyone have any, to look at the macro level, any stats or data on the shift in the future of business correlated to the future of work? So what I mean by that is, how many businesses are changing to not want to be unicorns, doing social responsibility, really, doing DEI, really, infinite game thinking. So this kind of whole shift in business, and is that correlated to flex? So if 80 or 90% of those businesses that are taking on that complexion are embracing flex, then maybe we just let the dinosaurs die out of natural causes. But anyway, I just wonder if there's any macro level data on if we get out of how we work into the actual complexion of business and how it's changing and at what pace.
Yeah, if you're serious about diversity, then you got to be serious about flexibility. The two just go hand in hand, right? There's tons of evidence.
Yeah.
We see it, whether it's in the old future form data about 59% of working moms, 47% of working dads want to work from home 3 days a week or more. You can see it in the employment data of people with disabilities in the United States. You can see it in the employment data of women with kids under 5. You can see it in government hiring records, because the U.S. federal government has to keep track of job applicants and who gets hired. You divvy them up among people who's applying for jobs that are full-time in the office versus telework versus remote. These huge spikes in women that are applicants for more flexible jobs, veterans who are applicants for more flexible jobs. And so there's just huge societal benefits, to all of this. And I think that's one of the things that I've just continued to fear for the past 2 years, is especially in the larger companies that are saying get back in the office, is they reward the people who show up the most, which are more often than not non-primary caregiver white males like me. So we got a proximity bias risk that we're running in those companies, and that's why I continue to hope that the ones that get it kind of take a little more share, do better.
I would love to call on Melissa Fisher if you're here and willing to give us some of your hot fire commentary, deep empathetic insights. You got anything, Melissa?
I'm just trying to bring in. Yeah, I'm curious about we've talked a lot about various things, but how do you think people are reconstructing the meaning that they attach to work, to flexible work? I mean, what are the kind of cultural shifts that you think we're seeing in the U.S. and beyond?
I had a little bit of a hard time hearing the end of your comment. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I don't know if my mic is the perfect. So I'm an anthropologist, and I'm always interested in how people are rethinking the meaning of work. And as we sort of move out of this remote boom, I guess somebody said, I'm wondering if you can address sort of not the workplace cultural shifts, but the cultural shifts that we're seeing maybe in American society, and perhaps over the globe, about people rethinking the meaning and value of work.
Yeah, you may be better positioned to speak on that than either of us, but
I think, yeah, but
I mean, what I do see is that basically the pandemic itself caused people to reconsider pretty obviously what their priorities are. I think it's also caused us to question a lot of assumptions. The U.S. specifically is a very live to work country, right? Very live to work culture, and I certainly did that myself for quite a while. And I think it's caused us to question that aspect, but it's also caused us to question, where does community come from? And community and even trust was built inside of organizations too much, because it sort of fell apart. Church going went down. We don't trust politicians of any stripe. We don't trust the system, quote unquote. And so, where do you build and find community? One of the things that's actually been really nice, I live in San Francisco. I'm in an area called Noe Valley. We now have what's called a slow street. It's a street that's blocked from traffic going through it. People walk it and walk their dogs. There's a coffee shop that's gotten hugely popular. You can hang out, you can meet people, you can have conversations. Good God forbid, community in your local neighborhood might not be the world's worst thing for us to all sort of redevelop.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
Could I add something there, Melissa? Just because I'm kind of like living a version of it myself right now.
That's
like
true.
literally
Yeah.
right now, I'm looking out at the ocean on the northeast shore of Prince Edward Island. I'm up at my cottage today because we had someone coming to fix our heating and cooling system. I'm on Starlink internet. I'm in a virtual world with all of you. And I'm living in a place that I firmly can't grasp how I would have accelerated myself to rather than inflected myself to, were it not for the pandemic. And for me, I've completely reoriented what work means to me. When I was inside the CBRE office 9 to 5 every day, I was fixated on being the top office leasing agent. I was fixated on pats on the back, et cetera, et cetera. Now I'm fixated on being as close to my family and community as I possibly can be. I'm not only just close to them, like with them, making an impact, volunteering my time, going down to the streets that Brian just mentioned, building up new business ventures, such as the one that I'm sitting in right now. This is not a place that I can afford without it being rented. and any other ways of sort of like broadening my opportunity to live my life, really, is what I'm looking for. And I think that that is both an inflection point and an acceleration. And I'm one of the fortunate few, is the thing that I think about a lot. Like, I'm going through a bit of financial upheaval right now because some of my income streams have dipped, but I still have the autonomy and the agency to decide where I am. Very few people can actually be in a spot like me right now. I can't see why it shouldn't be the case that more employees should have the opportunity to sit whatever version of the North Shore that is for them. And that could be a physical place, or it really could be a state of mind. That's my take on it.
If I may, Dave, just piggyback off on your comment.
Yeah, go ahead, please. I would love you to.
Great, thank you. So I totally echo that sentiment. And as a pre-pandemic remote worker, there's something inherently intuitive about making the decision to not only all of us sit at this table today, but to push this narrative forward in terms of flex work, working from anywhere, taking a 30,000-foot view of all of this. I think to your earlier point, Dave, of are we in a rut? Are we stuck on this conversation? And what I'd like to remind ourselves is it's a systemic situation that we're in. And so we're seeing that socioeconomically we're shifting, our values are shifting. We're going deeper inside into the cores of who we are as people outside of work. And I think that's only progressing this narrative forward. And although it might seem like we're stagnating, I think there should be an element of thinking about perhaps we're all just planting this seed. We're planting this seed for growth. Perhaps we're not seeing it immediately the way that we want to see it. Perhaps we're seeing it through the lens of our own egos. But if we remove ourselves from all of that and we say, okay, what are we trying to achieve for the greater good? I think we all here today are contributing to that. And so it is the way forward, I must say. And I've lived it. I've been in a world where I thought my reality was through the corporate ranks. And I quickly realized there was something inside of me that was saying, nope, this isn't for me. And you have to have kind of the strength to chart your own course. But along the way, you meet people who are also doing that. I think that's the benefit of a space like this that I'm very grateful to have a seat at. More so just commentary on overall.
Yeah, thank you. That was so great. And I'm actually, like, I just turned around the room. This is one of our larger sessions lately. So if nothing else, Nick and Brian, thank you for helping us draw an audience. I want to keep moving this conversation forward and really beyond the data and stuff. Hina, you just really made it, like, I don't know, you set the table really nicely there. Does anyone else have any more depth that they can offer to this conversation, personal or societal?
Sophie has a question in the chat.
Hi all. Oh goodness, a lot of echo, but sorry about that. So I'd love to ask about the bigger picture which all of this fits into. That, you know, we've been anticipating, or many companies have been anticipating the need for flexible working, and there has been a lot more flexible working over the last 20 years, workplace flexibility, or rather probably the last 15 years, that Kate Lister and people like Callie Yost and folks have been tracking. And, you know, where do you see, how many companies are you seeing, Nick and Brian in particular, that are really seeing how flexible working, new ways of working are sort of incredibly important enabling pieces, but they're not the picture itself. It's a much bigger, the much bigger issues in terms of how we're doing business, how we need to have flexible operations and flexible frameworks, and we have flatter organizations, all of that aspect. What are you seeing with the people that you're talking to in terms of where this fits into the bigger puzzle?
Hey, so fantastic to catch up but even on avatars like this.
Exactly.
So, no, it's a great question. I'll start with a. I got a big echo for some reason. Yeah, I think. Okay, great, thanks. So I'll start with two ways of looking at it, just on what's happening. One is things like the Flex Index, and the other is just look at work from home days. You were right that pre-pandemic we were on a clear upward trend. The pandemic has increased at least the amount of work from home by about 40 years versus the trend. So we wouldn't be where we are now until probably 2040. So we've kind of like had warp speed in one of those science fiction movies where we've moved ahead. Why is this happening? When I talk to companies, the overriding reason they are supporting, hybrid flexibility is to make money. I'm not sure that's that bad in a sense. So I think it's the reason also why it's stuck. So when I talk to execs, I say, look, this is profitable for your business. Employees really want to be able to work from home. You see retention and recruitment rates. I've done a couple of randomized control trials. They're down 30 to 50% drop quit rates if you allow people to work from home. Employees value it about the same as typically an 8% pay increase. You get all of that for like no impact on productivity. So in a sense, what's not to like? So I think it's easier to persuade execs, and it's the line I take is, look, this is not about a social movement. I mean, I love work from home. I'm at home right now. But if you're trying to persuade, senior execs, I spoke to David Solomon, for example, from Goldman Sachs on the phone about a year ago. Much easier to pitch to them. Look, this is a good way to run your business. So I think they actually go hand in hand. I mean, I see this as the thing I wrote in the New York Times, this is a very rare moment as an economist where we have a change where we have almost all winners. So normally when you have changes, there's winners and losers, and it's a process of, making the losers good. In this case, firms win, it's profitable. Employees clearly win because we're much happier, and society wins because it's reducing pollution, it's giving parents more time with their kids. It's like an incredibly fortunate moment in time. And I think the reason it will stick is actually it's just simply profitable for companies to do it. And, I'm happy with that, actually. If it wasn't profitable, I'd be fearful it would suddenly get overturned and there's a recession. But it isn't, and it is profitable. And so I think it's a stable, permanent, long-run shift.
Yes, I agree with all of those things. And it's great chatting with you finally. I also see that I was deep in the workplace flexibility space since 2011, and I completely understand that the official work days that were happening from home prior to the pandemic was 5% or less. But overall, there was a huge amount of flexibility, or there was a lot of unofficial. There was quite a lot of flexibility and movement, and only 47% of US employees had never worked remotely at all. So, to try and get the shift to flexible versus fixed hybrid, it does seem to me that needs to be some impetus, which is really focused on the business rather than benefiting employees. I love the win-win, and I talk about that when I can, but the flexible versus fixed does seem to be more of a business focus. No?
I think, my experience with big companies is it's for different parts of the organization. So if I just take Stanford, 20,000 employees, about between 1,000 to 2,000 are fully remote. Why does Stanford have 1,000 to 2,000 people fully remote? These people are very effective. We don't have to pay for office space for them. You can hire them across the country or possibly even globally. Most large organizations have some fully remote. They also have some hybrid. Hybrid tends to be more fixed team by team, but some of them, like Brian mentioned, I don't know whether you call it Lassie and hybrid or not. Some of them have slightly more, alternative rotating patterns. My sense is for most large companies, they're going to have a mix. So in Stanford, just to give you numbers, about 2,000 are fully remote, about 10,000 are hybrid, and about 8,000 come into the office every day. In fact, it's not the office. These are people like, food service, security, cleaning, teach. I always teach in person. So I think there's going to be a mix. And I think that's actually the best place to be. When we survey folks, we survey both Americans and people across 34 countries now, you find about half of people want to be hybrid, around 30% want to be fully remote, and 20% want to be fully in person. So I love the place we're going to end up in, which is there's just a range of offerings from companies, and you pick what you want. And I think it's going to change over the life cycle. Folks in their 20s may pick almost entirely in person, get their 30s, they have young kids. Like Dave was mentioning, they maybe want to move away. they go in, fully remote, and then at some point, maybe like me, I'm approaching an empty nester. I'm 50, and so in a few years maybe you drift back into hybrid. But I think choice and the flexibility is going to give us the best of both worlds.
Yeah, right on. I've always heard the phrase, we should reserve the right to change our minds based on the seasons of our lives. I want to call on someone else, John Riordan, former speaker and a metaverse convert. You got my friend.
Thanks, Dave. Hi, Nick. Hi, Brian. A lot of the conversation so far rotates around North America. Are you personally surprised at how English language centric the movement has been, and how the non-English speaking countries are laggards in their approach to remote work? And even when you look at the European markets, the non-English speaking markets that are actually moving almost in tandem with the English language markets are Germany, Holland, and one or two of the Scandinavian countries who are much more adept at English than most of us, to be honest. So what will it take for this to become significantly more global than English language centric?
Brian, you got thoughts?
A little bit. There is some degree of difference too culturally in terms of, so going back to the earlier part of the conversation about living to work and versus working to live. Western Europeans in particular, have been far better than Americans for a long time at doing things like actually taking vacations and taking breaks and walking away from it. I also know that there's at least some difference especially in the commercial spaces in France and Germany, than there was pre-pandemic. So some of that has shifted. I think if you look more broadly and more globally, there's just fundamental differences. I mean, the average house size in the United States is 6 times bigger than the average house size in China. The average commute in some places, I had teams working for me in India at the beginning of the pandemic that would have loved to have had access to the office because home is multi-generational, it is tiny, and it has lousy Wi-Fi. So there are infrastructure differences, there are cultural differences, I think, that are doing this. I'm more interested in how, the sort of broader movement helps us get better employee engagement, sort of tying back to the earlier conversation, that actually drives better business results. And doing that certainly has had bigger gaps in some of the English language countries than some of the others.
John, happy to jump. Lovely to catch up, and thank you for the introduction to Michael Horvath as well, which is fantastic. I say we've been looking at data across almost 40 countries, and there are 4 things driving it. 3 are obvious and one's kind of interesting. They're going to echo what Brian said. So one is, income level, GDP per capita. Rich countries have more work from home. You tend to be more tech and finance. Second is population density. So places with more space tend to have more work from home because it's easier. So you mentioned the US has a lot of land. It's easier to do it. Australia has a lot of space. The third is cumulative lockdown. So places with a long lockdown have higher levels of work from home now. And I think the reason is you are forced to adapt and get used to it. And you discovered, hey, this is pretty good. And people stick with it. And then the final thing that's the most interesting is coming back to the cultural stuff. Guy Hofstadter, who's a sociologist going back, 30, 40, 50 years. And he developed this measure called power distance, which is basically how much managers are willing to let employees take decisions. I think Brian mentioned earlier, someone did trust them. So very low levels turn out to be Asian countries. It's very hierarchical. But, managers want to hold control. They don't want to trust, lower level employees. At the other end, North America tends to actually have a pretty low level of power distance. So, that's very decentralized. That turns out to be a big determinant of work from home. And I think that's where the Anglo-Saxon countries end up really moving ahead. They tend to have organizational structures, management structures that allow frontline employees, middle-level employees to take decisions. And one famous anecdote is in wars. If you look at the US military, it tends to be more about letting frontline troops take decisions and less about command and control from the general. So we see it in very many dimensions, but I think I'll stop there. I think that is a lot of what's explaining this Anglo-Saxon thing. The Anglo-Saxon companies tend to be relatively decentralized.
Thank you for that, Nick. Before we keep going, do you, Nick and Brian, have a couple of minutes, or are you a hard stop in 1 minute? Just want to ask.
I'm good.
Nick, what about you?
I have another. I do have another meeting with basically folks in the UK, believe it or not, talking about international.
Got it. For anyone who's had their mic muted, that would be great. So Nick, you got to jump then. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's okay. And John, I hear you sound. You're Irish, by the way.
Yes, I am indeed.
Fantastic. This is like, across the Anglo-Saxon world range of accents here. Yeah, I'm sorry. I've got to jump, Dave, because I got a call with the guys at the Bank of England. I'm actually collecting UK data on this.
Not a problem. Thank you so much for your time. For everyone else who wants to stick around, more than happy to continue, like as a group and with Brian, because I think this is great to have this many people here. So does anyone want to keep going? And if anyone feels like they need to leave, of course, go ahead. We want to respect your time. I see my friend Kelly on. I've always got something fiery to say. What do you got? If we're wrapping up, if no one else is coming to the table in the next episode with something they want to riff on, we end here. And thank you again in advance. And we just love if everyone could stick around for a little picture. Good. Okay, I'm getting the feeling that we may be fini for now.
I think it might be picture time.
Yeah, a big thank you to everyone who showed up today. This is one of our larger sessions in recent times, so seriously, thank you very much.
All right, gonna empty the table here. All right, let's go stand under the pictures, and we'll try and get a snapshot.
Yeah, we can all just stand in the front here, and everyone just move yourself. So here, don't worry about, whether you're holding hands with anybody or moving through people's physical bodies. It's all good. And John, are you going to grab the photo?
Yeah, I will. I'll grab the photo. And I will tell you, I've got the camera up kind of near the light. So if everybody wants to press space bar and kind of look up a little bit, you can do that. And then we'll wave, which is F1. Is that correct? And so
F1, yeah.
I'll press F1 at the count of 3. And so I'll give a 1, 2, 3. All right. And let's try one more. 1, 2, and 3. Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for coming.